Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video I'm going to show you the other way to calculate the inflation rate, which is called the GDP deflator. So remember, we measure the inflation rate by tracking percent change in the price level, kind of the floor of a building we're on if you want to think of an elevator. And so in the last video we looked at CPI as one measure of the price level, the GDP deflator would be the other. But before I tell you about the GDP deflator, I want to introduce two very important concepts that we're going to be seeing again and again throughout the remainder of macro. The first one's the idea of a nominal value. So a nominal value is any number not adjusted for inflation. So the way I remember that is there's no in the word nominal, so no, not adjusted. And so, for example, nominal GDP would be GDP calculated using current year's prices. So whatever year we're in, that's the prices that we are going to use with that year's quantities. And we'll see how to calculate that in a minute. Another example would be the nominal wage, which is just the wage not adjusted for inflation, whatever it's being reported that year. There's the nominal interest rate, which is the price to borrow money in that year's prices. So just not adjusted for inflation. The other side of this is a real value, which is a value adjusted for inflation. It gives us the real, the authentic impact, right? So for example, real GDP would be GDP adjusted for inflation by calculating it using a current year's output but a base year's prices to better reflect changes in output. Because, for example, if nominal GDP, not adjusted, so let's say nominal GDP, let's say in year one was like $500, okay? And then in year two, let's say it was $1,000. So if I asked you, did GDP increase? I mean, nominally, yes, but how do we know that wasn't a change in just the prices, right? Like, how do we know it was a change in output, right? Because if GDP is increasing, we want it to be because we're producing more stuff, not necessarily because the price of the things we were producing are more expensive, if that makes any sense. So by adjusting for inflation, we can get rid of the price changes and just focus on changes in output, which is what we want to do when we're looking at GDP, right? When we track changes in GDP, we want to adjust for inflation so we can just focus on did we produce more stuff or not. Not did we maybe produce more stuff, but it could be price changes. So that's why adjusting for inflation, getting the real value, whether it's the real GDP, the real interest rate, the real wage, any of those, it's better to get that than the nominal version, okay? So now I will say this, like for the nominal version, I mean, the nominal value is what you see in the store, right? Like if I go to Walmart right now and I buy a lamp for 25 bucks, they're quoting me the nominal price, right? They're quoting me the price in non-adjusted terms, right? And so, yeah, I could get like a calculator out and try to figure out, okay, what does it actually cost me in real value? But yeah, in the store, you're being quoted nominal prices that aren't adjusted for inflation, right? Okay, with that all in mind, how do we get the GDP deflator? So first of all, just to help you understand what the GDP deflator is, it is simply another measure of the price level. But instead of using a market basket of what a consumer buys, we're looking at GDP, which is everything that's being produced. And so, I don't want to get into right now, like how is that different than CPI? We'll talk about that at the end. So, how do we measure the price level using the GDP deflator? So what I have here, and I actually pulled this right off of an APFRQ, we have food, shirts. They called it entertainment. I called it fun because fun could fit in the box, so whatever. And then we have the 2009 quantities of how much of this stuff was bought, 6, 5, and 2 units, whatever. And then we have the 2009 price for each of these things, and we're going to say 2009 is the base year, or the year we're comparing all other years to. And so food was $2.50, shirts was $6, fun was $4. and then we have the 2010 quantities and their prices. And so we need to find the GDP deflator. And so here's the steps to do that, to find the deflator in both 2009 and 2010. So the first step is to get the nominal GDP in each year, the GDP not adjusted for inflation, which would mean we're going to use the current year's prices and the current year's quantities. So we're not going to adjust for inflation here. We're just going to use that year's quantities and prices. So how would we do that? So for 2009, what we would do is we would say, okay, there were 6 units of food. Each one cost $2.50, plus the 5 units of clothing or shirts, and those cost $6, plus the 2 units of fun, and each of those cost $4. And if we add that all together, we get $53 for the cost of all of those things. So it works very similar to how we calculated the market basket value, okay? Again, make sure we keep the processes straight because they're gonna deviate here and they're not gonna be exactly the same. So make sure you know which one you're calculating, right? So, I mean, if they're giving you, if they're talking about GDP in the question, then yeah, you're gonna want to use the deflator. If they're talking about a market basket, then yeah, that's CPI. Again, the more practice you get with this stuff, the better, and you'll be given a lot of practice for sure. Okay, and then we've got 2010, and so again, we're going to use 2010 quantities, 2010 prices. We're not adjusting for inflation, so the base year doesn't matter here. We're just going to use that year's quantities and prices. So it's going to be 8 times 250 for the food, plus 10 times 10 for the shirts, plus 5 times 5 times, we'll use the X, times 5 for the fun, and that gets me to $145. Okay, so again, make sure, pause the video, make sure we understand each step, because there's 4 steps to getting the deflator, unlike 3 for CPI, or the inflation rate using CPI. So we want to make sure that we understand each step. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2 is a little more complicated, because now we've got to find the real GDP for 2009 and 2010. So pay attention here. What we're going to do is, to get the real GDP for a given year, we're going to take the current year's quantities, but the base year's prices. So what we're doing here is we're holding the prices constant so we can just look at, did we produce more or less output, right? Because that's what real GDP does. It gets rid of the price changes so we can just focus on, was more stuff made or not? So how do we do this? So for 2009, the answer is going to be no different than 2009 nominal GDP, because we're going to use 2009's quantities, and because 2009 is the base year, we're also using their prices. So it's just $53. The math is identical to what we did for nominal GDP for 2009. So in the base year, the nominal GDP and the real GDP are always the same number, because there's no adjusting for inflation, because you're using that year's prices. It's 2010 where we have to do a little more work here, because yes, we're going to use 2010's quantities, but again, we're going to use 2009's prices because they're the base year's prices. So how do we do this? So again, we're going to do 8, but then we're multiplying by the base year cost of the food, which was $2.50. It was the same price in both years, 2009, 2010, so that's not going to change. But when we get to the shirts, it's going to be it's going to be 10 shirts times, but we're going to use the $6 price, because that is the base year price for the shirts, plus we've got 5 units of fun, but then we use the base year's price of $4. We add all that together, and that is going to give us 20 plus 60 plus 20, which is $100 for real GDP in 2010. So again, we use the current year's quantities. So I use 2010's quantities of 8, 10, and 5, but I use the base year's prices of 250, 6, and 4. So what we're trying to do is we're just trying to look at changes in quantity. We are not looking at changes in prices because we are trying to adjust for inflation here, okay? Now again, the goal is to figure out the inflation rate, okay? So we're getting there. We're really, really close because now we're going to find the price level. We're going to measure the price level, what floor are we on, and we're going to use the GDP deflator to do it. So the GDP deflator has its own formula, okay? But in reality, it looks really similar in terms of how it's set up to CPI. You're going to take one number, divide it by another number, and then multiply it by 100. In this case, it's nominal GDP for the year you're looking for the year's GDP deflator you're looking for, divided by real GDP in that year, so year X in my example, and then multiply the result by 100. So, how would we find the GDP deflator in 2009 and 2010? So you can pause the video, see if you can find the GDP deflators, and we'll see if you're right. So we'll use a different color this time. So for 2009, again, the 2009 is the base year, and yes, the base year trick does apply here, where the base year deflator is going to always be 100. And so how would I show this? So nominal GDP in 2009 was $53. The real GDP was also $53. And then I multiply that by 100. And so the GDP deflator in the base year of 2009 is 100. So we're basically on floor 100. That's the price level we're at. And so what you notice here with price levels is they're only useful when you're comparing them to another price level, right? Because a price level of 100 doesn't really mean anything unless we're comparing the change of it to another year. And so let's do that with 2010. So for 2010, we actually have to do some math here. So the nominal GDP in 2010 was $145. We divide that by the real GDP in 2010, which was $100. Multiply the result by 100, and we get a GDP deflator of 145. No units on deflators, just like with CPI, no units. And so the GDP deflator in 2010 was 145. That's the price level. That's the floor we're at. And so if you notice, from 2009 until 2010, we moved up several floors, 45 floors, and so there we know there was inflation because the number got bigger. The final step is to determine, well, by what percent bigger, and that's how we get the inflation rate. And luckily, getting the inflation rate is no different than how we would have with CPI once we calculated those price levels. We just find percent change. So it's new minus old divided by old times 100. And so the inflation rate from 2009 to 2010 was 45%, which we know would be insanely high, right? Because we want an inflation rate of somewhere around 2 to 3%, 1 to 2%, 2 to 3%, somewhere in there. Again, the exact number isn't that important, but we want pretty low inflation, and 45% is orders of magnitude higher than that. So with the GDP deflator, again, I just recommend practicing doing it. Come up with your own numbers. Plug in some different numbers for food, shirts, and fun, for numbers and prices, quantities and prices. Practice with it, and you'll get better at it. But memorize those formulas for the deflator as well as CPI. Finally, just to compare the CPI with the GDP deflator, the GDP deflator measures the prices of all goods produced, whereas CPI only looks at what is bought by consumers. So remember, GDP consists of consumer spending, government spending, business spending, net exports. And so GDP is a much broader look at inflation than the consumer price index that only looks at what is being bought by consumers. So that's all for this video on the GDP deflator. Until next time, have a great day.